All right. All right. So we're on chapter 8 of The Cloud of Unknowing. And last week we got some instructions on finding a word, or in Vedanta terms, a mantra. In this book, they say really it can be any word that takes the mind higher. They suggest the word love, or the word God, or the word spirit, which are basically just different ideas. A word whose definition is infinite. Really, that's helpful. Any name of God. So a name of God would be things like beauty, love, grace, um, life. Words that the more you think about them, the deeper they go, the more they reveal, the more every time you say them, they can mean something a little bit deeper, a little bit more than what you did the previous time. And so he is suggesting this because he's trying to get us to a state of no thought. And in order to get to that state of no thought, we're starting with a mind with lots of thought, lots of uncontrolled thought. And we're not really in the habit of silent mind. And so we have to really retrain ourselves to use our mind as it was intended, which is basically when it's not necessary, it's silent. And when we need it, we use it. It's a tool, right? But as Eckhart Tolle has pointed out in his book, The Power of Now, we've become addicted to thinking. And so the mind is constantly noisy. And even when we don't need to think, we're thinking. And it's kind of a funny thing. We've talked about this before, but, there's only one person in your body. It's you. Whatever that you is what we're trying to find out. But the thing about that you is that it is both the thinker and the one listening to your thoughts. So we often think that thinking is necessary, in order to know something. But the fact is that all knowledge comes from inside out. And so it always arises as an aha, or a eureka. I can't remember who that famous scientist was that was in the bathtub and discovered something and jumped out screaming eureka. Anybody know? Is that familiar to anyone? All right, it's one of those big Italian scientists from the Middle Ages. Anyway, but Vivekananda says that education is not adding information from the outside in. It's allowing the information, allowing that infinite store of information that we have within us to manifest. And we do that with silent mind, with meditation, with contemplation, allowing it to come forward. So it's not a result of a thought process, right? It's basically coming to a point of quietness or stillness or focus that allows it to arise within. We have that aha moment where we see something new. We understand something new. How many times had apples fallen off of trees before Newton witnessed it and was in that state and was like, hey, that means something, right? And then comes up with that knowledge. So chapter 8, it starts with our little blurb here at the beginning. An accurate treatment by question and answer of certain doubts that may arise during this exercise, the suppression of rational investigation, knowledge, and intellectual acumen, distinguishing the various levels and divisions of the active and contemplative lives. All right. He says, but now you will ask, what is this thought that presses upon me in this work? And is it a good or an evil thing? Right? If it is an evil thing, you say, then I am very much surprised because it serves so well to increase a man's devotion. So he's talking about what he's talking about, frankly, for us, is this idea of mantra meditation and wanting to know, is it an evil thing, right? Because for Christians, they're very conservative about practices and philosophies and systems of thinking that may or may not be true. And since they've got a devil who's actively working against them, they're quite defensive about that. And so he's asking, this practice that we're talking about, this mantra meditation, is this something that's permissible for a Christian to undertake? And he's saying the first thing, he says that if it's an evil thing, I'm very much surprised because it serves so well to increase a man's devotion. And at times I believe that it is a great comfort to listen to what it has to say. For I believe that sometimes it can make me weep very bitterly out of the compassion for Christ in his passion, and sometimes for my own wretched state, and for many other reasons. All these, it seems to me, are very holy and do me much good. And therefore, I believe that these things can in no way be evil. And if it is good, and their sweet tales do me such good, then I am very surprised why you bid me to put them deep down under the cloud of forgetting. This strikes me as being a very good question, right? And so I must reflect in order to answer it as well as my feebleness permits. First, when you ask me what this thought is that presses so hard upon you in this exercise, offering to help you in this work, I will answer that it is a well defined and clear sight of your natural intelligence imprinted upon your reason within your soul, right? That would be the chit of Satchit Ananda, right? This is that intelligence, that natural intelligence impressed upon the soul. We know that the image of God that Christians refer to, it can be further described as Satchitananda, that presence of intelligence, that presence of love, and existence itself or being. And so that being the image of God, that's what he's referring to, this natural intelligence imprinted upon your reason and your soul within your soul. And when you ask me whether it is good or evil, I say that it must be of necessity be always good in its nature, because it is a ray of God's likeness. All right, there he arrives at it. It's an array, or it's a ray of God's likeness. It is the image of God that has been placed within us, presumably at the creation of ourself, or the manifestation of ourself. But we know that the manifestation of ourself pre-exists the material, right? That we really are all that same image of God manifesting through different sets of limitations, right? Our own histories, our own ideals, our own thinking, upbringing, nationalities, education, all the things that came in through our senses, right, have created a set of ideas that restrict us and limit us. Every attribute that we claim is a limitation. It excludes us from any other attribute that competes with it. And so we have this image of God within us that is manifesting. It's always exuding love, wisdom, and being. But between that and the outside world is this, the ego machine, right? The machine that creates a thought of ourself in order to exist in a world of thought. And so that ego is what prisms our expression of love and prevents it from being unlimited, prevents it from being unconditioned, prevents it from being free, right? And so that's our condition. And in that, really, the purpose of life is to set that free, to die before we die, as Paul says in the New Testament, so that it is no longer we who live, but the Christ, or that perfection that dwells within us, that pure image of God. So our effort in spiritual life is to diminish ego so that our natural light can flow out freely in all directions and no longer be limited to little squirts, from a garden hose, as it were. All right. So he says, and when you ask me whether it is good, right, or evil, I say that it must of necessity be always good in its nature because it is a ray of God's likeness. It is that image of God. But the use of it can be both good and evil. And this is like anything else in the world, right? Nothing in and of itself is good or evil. Everything depends about until it meets you, right? It's one of the things that have occurred in an early meditation when I realized that nothing in the world is in and of itself good or evil. It waits until it meets me, and I determine whether it's good or evil, right? A hammer used for building a house is a good thing. A hammer for killing your neighbor is an evil thing. but a hammer in and of itself is neither good or evil. All right. And so that's the nature of everything outside of ourselves in this universe, right? Technology, is it good or evil? Well, depends. It can be a great thing. It can be a tool to feed the hungry and to spread compassion and education, love letters. It can be a wonderful thing. It can also do everything else that it does that we know that bind us, right? That make us smaller. And so it's really that way. That's why in this world, it's not so much what you do that's important, but how you do it, right? And so this body is the same way. This body is neither inherently evil nor inherently good. The body is a manifestation. If you're manifesting evil, manifesting an ego, right, the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, if you put that in charge, it's going to tend toward selfishness. It's going to tend toward things that we would call evil, right? Things that are unhelpful to our freedom. And if we use it in the other direction, to serve, to love, to spread wisdom and joy, light, beauty, then it's a beautiful thing. So the body is neither one way or the other. Now, believing yourself to be the body mind would be a general negative thing for yourself because then you would adopt all of the concerns of body mind that tend toward selfishness, tend toward smallness, right? And so that is the problem in this world. The body itself was made by God, right? We see that in Genesis. God made the body. So obviously God cannot make something evil. So the body was there. And then he breathes his own spirit, his spirit of life, into that body. And that is what expresses, that's what animates the body, that's what makes a body live and become an individual, right? And so far so good. But what does that self believe itself to be? To the extent that it knows itself to be the image of God, it's going to be a beautiful influence in the world. To the extent that it believes it's a body mind, it's going to be a smaller, less helpful influence in the world. So we're trying to set ourselves free by really knowing who we are. And we know who we are when nothing is telling us, right? When we are able to hear that very soft and non-intrusive expression of divine love, which is within us. So it is good when it is illumined by grace, so that you may see your wretched state, the passion, the kindness, and the wonderful works of God in his creatures, bodily and spiritual. And so it is no wonder that it increases your devotion as much as you say. But the use of it is evil when it is swollen with pride and with the curiosity which comes from the subtle speculation and learning, such as theologians have, which makes them want to be known, not as humble clerics and masters of divinity or of devotion, but proud scholars and of the devil and masters of vanity and falsehood. Right? So again, how you use it. And this is the thing, spiritual life itself, spiritual practice itself can be a helpful or an unhelpful thing, believe it or not, right? If we attach our ego to it, it becomes very unhelpful, right? We become smug, we become self-righteous, and we start hurting people, right? And you can see this danger in the religious world. I remember in the AIDS crisis, the late 80s and early 90s, that I lived through in San Francisco. And, at that point, there was like 12,000 young men died in that year, 1989, I think it was, or 90. 12,000 men, dead. And where were the religious people in San Francisco? They were lined up on the street corners with signs, you're getting what you deserve. Right? This is your punishment. God hates, gays. God hates homosexuals. Right? That whatever convinces you that that is an act of love is not helpful, right? It's an egoistic perspective. It's very satisfying to be right and to tell others that they're wrong. So that's a very big danger sign for us, and that's the problem with religion, right? It's not the religion itself. Religions have done much more good for the world than bad. Definitely religions have done bad. And definitely it will always be when egoism has been mixed in with them, right? When egoism mixes in with them, it becomes smug, becomes self-righteous, it becomes divisive, right? This is where fundamentalism comes from in all of our religions. Fundamentalism is the mixture of ego and religion. When the ego and the religion comes into religion, then ego starts creating boundaries that are not there by nature, right? We're all one. We're bound in love to the oneness of God. And as an ego self, ego always is looking for differences, always looking for distinctions, right? And placing them in relationship to everything else. And so it will also do that with religion. It will divide it, look for differences, and then it will identify with it. I'm a Christian and I'm the only one that's right, right? Or I'm a Muslim and I'm the only one that's right. Or I'm a Vedantist and I'm the only one that's right, right? It's that I'm the only one, which is the biggest sign of egoism and the most dangerous thought that can occur to a spiritual person, right? And so he's talking about here that even this practice that we're using, even your meditation, your contemplative thinking, that if you become proud of your practice, if you become proud of how much you practice, if you start practicing to be seen practicing, right? If you start practicing so that you can be eloquent, well, then it's going to be wickedness. It's not going to be of benefit to very many people. And so we don't want to do our practice for those reasons. We do our practice to enjoy the presence of God, to draw closer to that image of God that is within us. All right, so that's why he says that there are some that are practicing not to be known as humble clerics and masters of divinity or of devotion, but rather they want to become proud scholars, right? They want to become known for their knowledge and masters of vanity and falsehood, right? That's presenting ourselves as something that we're not. That's why one of the second one of the three most important things that we know about religion, one of them is exactly that your words, your deeds, and your thoughts, your speech, your thoughts, and your actions are always in alignment, right? So there's no hypocrisy in there. If you start presenting yourself as a teacher, and unfortunately, I'm very self-aware of these problems with being put forward as a teacher. The ego is always there, wanting to take credit for the things that Mother is doing, for that the divine is doing. Right? You give a nice class, you give a nice lecture. The ego wants to own it, right? And it wants to puff you up. Oh, I'm a good speaker. Oh, I'm a good teacher. Oh, I'm helping everybody. Very, 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 very dangerous things, right? Which is why we have to understand we're not the doers. It is the beloved that manifests through us. And to the degree that we're able to get our ego out of the way to be a pure presentation of that expression of the divine, to that extent we're holy. And it manifests as being loving and unselfish, right? So that's how you know. If you want to know how you're doing as a spiritual person, those are your two questions. Am I unselfish? Am I loving? And to the extent that you can say yes to those two questions, to that extent, you're being spiritual, right? He says, and in other men and women, whether they be religious or seculars, the use and exercise of this natural understanding is evil when it is swollen with proud and clever learning of worldly things and earthly ideas, for the coveting of worldly honors and rich possessions, and the pleasure of and vainglory which comes from men's flatterings. Right? So this this is why it's important to practice in a sense of surrendering and not doing, right? To understand that practice is opening up to the presence. It's not an achievement. It's not an addition to ourself. It's not an accomplishment. It is a surrender because our nature is divine, right? It was God who placed within us the image of God. And so that is one difference from mainstream, from what is often taught in mainstream Christianity, and what would be closer to the truth. You know, they always are wanting to talk about our nature being evil, being sinful. Hmm, no. How do we know that? Because Adam fell, right? After Adam fell, yes, the ego nature is wicked, right? The evil nature is not helpful to, though the ego nature is not helpful to us. So if we were to call that our nature, which is what modern mainstream Christianity does, then there's truth in that. But the problem with that is that that's not what we are. We're not the fallen, right? Because Adam existed before his fall. So that means his true nature is the image of God, is godlike. And so we reassert that our true nature is godlike. It's holy, it's beautiful, it's lovely, right? And the expression of egoism, right? The identity with body mind creates that ego self. And if we believe ourselves to be body mind and act accordingly, that is when we become unhelpful. That's when we become egotistical or evil, if you want to use that word. He says, next, you ask me why you should put down such thoughts under the cloud of forgetting, since it is true that they are good of their kind, and when well used, they do you so much good and greatly increase your devotion. My answer is that you must clearly understand that there are two kinds of lives in the Holy Church. One is the active life, and the other is the contemplative life. Now, this is very interesting. You know, the whole Ramakrishna order went through a huge discussion around this when it was formed, because there were some monks that were saying, you know, oh, Ramakrishna doesn't want us out working and doing things like that. He wants us doing our spiritual practice, right? And then there's the other side that's saying, no, our spiritual practice has to be expressed by the worship of God in living beings. You know, that our expression of our spirituality happens through service, you know, through training and teaching others and helping others find their way. And that's why, incidentally, the Ramakrishna order has two parts to it. That's why they call it the Ramakrishna Mat and Mission. Mat is monastery, cloistered, contemplation, you know, for practice. And the mission is what does the schools and the orphanages and the teacher colleges and the universities and all of those things that the order does. And so it's two sides hand in hand. It's not one or the other. If you're doing either one of them properly, the other one is implicated. Right? The active life is the lower and the contemplative life is the higher. And he's going to get that from that interaction between Mary and Martha. You remember Mary and Martha, they invited Jesus over to the house to feed him. And I can't remember who did what, but one of them, either Mary or Martha, was sitting at the feet of Jesus and just listening, enraptured by what he was teaching. And I think it was Martha, maybe, who was, you know, fixing the hors d'oeuvres in the kitchen and trying to get the Kool-Aid together and everything served for the dinner. And she gets frustrated because Mary's sitting in there doing nothing and just listening to Jesus and not helping. And she comes in and, you know, makes a judgment and asks Jesus to tell Mary to help me cook. And Jesus tells him Mary has made the right choice, right? Well, of the two, contemplation, the thought of God, is higher than what manifests from it, which is service of God and man, right? So the active life is the lower, and the contemplative life is the higher. Active life has 2 degrees, a higher and a lower, and the contemplative life also has 2 degrees, a lower and a higher. Further, these two lives are so joined together that though in part they are different, neither of them can be lived fully without having some part of the other. Okay? So you can't be purely contemplative and you can't be purely active. To do it right, it has to be a mixture of those two things. Your contemplation has to inform your action, right? Otherwise you won't be able to stay pure in it. You'll become prideful in it. Right? And the two parts of both of them, he says the lower and the higher in both of them. In Vedantic terms, we would talk in terms of vidya and avidya. light and dark. One of them, doing it in one way, will take you toward the singularity, toward the divine, and the other will take you toward the multiplicity or toward delusion, right? And so everything is a matter of how you practice, right? So not what we're doing in this world, but how we're doing it. Very important. For the higher part of the active life is the same as the lower part of the contemplative life. Hence, a man cannot be fully active unless he is partly contemplative, nor can he be fully contemplative here below unless he is in some way active. It is the nature of the active life both to be begun and ended in this life. Not so, however, of the contemplative life, which is begun in this life and shall last without end. That is why the part that Mary chose shall never be taken away. The active life is troubled and anxious about many things, but the contemplative life sits in peace, intent on one thing. The lower part of the active life consists in good and honest corporal works of mercy and of charity. The higher part of the active life and the lower part of the contemplative consists in good spiritual meditations and earnest consideration of a man's own wretched state with sorrow and contrition, of the passion of Christ and of his servants with pity and compassion, and the wonderful gifts, kindness, and works of God in all his creatures, corporeal and spiritual, with thanksgiving and praise. But the higher part of contemplation, insofar as it is possible to possess it here below, consists entirely in this darkness and in this cloud of unknowing, with a loving impulse and a dark gazing into the simple being of God himself alone. Right? So he's talking about the dark in this case in the same way that St. John of the Cross mentions it. It's the darkness of the night sky. We look at the night sky and we say, wow, look at how dark it is. But then when you follow it through with understanding, you realize the night sky can't be dark. Why? Because there's trillions of suns up there, right? You're looking out at that night sky, and there's trillions of stars, trillions of suns out there. And so how is it that it's black? How is it that it's dark? Well, there's no opposition. There's no resistance to it, right? Anything that resists it has its own illumination. The moon catches the light of the sun and reflects it, so it itself becomes a light, right? But in the vast openness of space, there's nothing to reflect it. There's no opposition to the sun, so it can't to the suns, so it can't be seen. There's nothing to see, and so it looks black. It looks dark. But in fact, if there was anything up there to oppose, it would reflect it, right? And so this is what we are. You and I are a creation that reflects or opposes, literally opposes the divine light, right? And so that is egoism. So we minimize that, right? We minimize that so that we become like Ramakrishna, a hole or a Jesus, a hole in the wall of egoism, a hole through which God can be seen, can be recognized. Right? Does that make sense? Is that unclear at all? All right. In the lower part of the active life, a man is outside himself and beneath himself. In the higher part of the active life and the lower part of the contemplative life, a man is within himself and on par with himself. All right. That's very interesting. So you've got outward going and inward going here. So in the lower part of active life, right, the life where you're doing, a man is outside himself, right? Because you're outgoing. You're in the world of the senses, the world of action. And beneath himself, right? Kind of probably what he's referring to this beneath himself means that any action is a limitation. It's not going, it's any action is, it's a limitation. So you can't, it can't, anything manifested has to have an ounce of me and mine in it, or a touch of me and mine. So in that sense, any expression of our divine nature is going to have to be done through me and mine, which is beneath ourselves. right? Because our self does not contain a me and mine. We are universal in our nature. We're not a particular. And so any action is going to be done by the lower self, right? So the lower part of the active life, a man is outside himself, he's outgoing, and beneath himself because there's a manifestation, there's an action. In the higher part of the active life and the lower part of contemplative life, a man is within himself, right? Go within, O mind. Dive deep, O mind. Find the gems laying within the chambers of the heart, right? A man is within himself and on par with himself, right? So this means that you are in that you're not above yourself. It's impossible to be higher than the divine nature, but you're on par with it. You're letting go of the ideas of body mind, egoism. You're diminishing egoism. So you're within yourself and you're on par with yourself, right? That's when you're sitting there contemplating God or contemplating presence or contemplating oneness or contemplating love or contemplating beauty. In those things, we can lose our separate self. We can lose the sense of distinction and merge with that divine reality. But in the higher part of the contemplative life, a man is above himself and under his God. Okay, they're going to frame it that way because, again, they see man's nature as being the fallen nature. And so basically, what we do is go higher than that, right? We transcend the fallen man by giving up our ego, and yet we're still below God because we still have a sense of separateness from God, right? And so that's where they're going to place us. Now, Vedanta is going to remove that distinction or says that it's possible to have that communion to the extent where there is no sense of separation, that there is no separation whatsoever. There's realization that ourself and God are one, that the only thing that was separating us was that we were a reflection and God was the source. But this reflection, right, is on an ego self. And so when that ego is diminished, you become a piece of glass, as it were. Right. So St. John needed a piece of glass because he wasn't allowed to say that he and God were one. Right. But in Vedanta, we don't have that fear. We say that when the ego is destroyed, when it's obliterated, we are one with God. It is God alone that is expressing within us at that point. And so there is a union there. He is above himself because he makes it his purpose to arrive by grace, whither he cannot come by nature. That is to say, to be knit to God in spirit, in oneness of love and union of wills. All right, beautiful. There it is. One can understand that it is impossible for a man to come to the higher part of the active life unless he leaves for a time the lower part. Right? And that's what Ramakrishna was saying. Every now and then, go off into the wilderness by yourself. Leave your cell phones, leave your relationships, leave your worries, leave your jobs, leave your computers, leave your phones, and go off and spend some time in contemplation of the divine. Right? To go and spend some time every now and then. So for a man to come to the higher part of active life, it's impossible unless he leaves for a time the lower part. In the same way, a man cannot come to the higher part of contemplative life unless he leaves for a time the lower part. It would be a wrong thing for a man engaged on meditation and a hindrance to him to turn his mind to the outward corporeal works which he had done or should do, even though in themselves they are very holy works. Right? So any time that we're going out through the senses, that is a compromise, right? We can do it for the sake of service, for the sake of love, and that will bring us closer to the unity. But we at the whole time are in danger of seeing ourselves as the doer and giving credit to ourselves as the actor, and that will be detrimental to us. In the same way, it would be very inappropriate and a great hindrance to a man who ought to be working in this darkness and in this cloud of unknowing, with an effective impulse of love to God for himself alone, to permit any thought or any meditation on God's wonderful gifts kindness, or his work in any of his creatures, bodily or spiritual, to rise up in his mind so as to press between him and his God, even if they should be very holy thoughts, and give him great happiness and consolation. I'm surprised that this is in here. But this is that notion that we're not separate from God. And so to sit and think of God, even if you sit and think of God with all of his good qualities, right, which is one form of meditation, it's the Lila meditation, the meditation on the life of Jesus or on the life of Buddha or Rama, right? And that is a valid meditation. There is a place for it in the progression to realization. But it is a lower form of contemplation, because even though you're thinking of God and even though you're thinking of all the good things that God has done and enjoying that grace, you still have an I that is separate and appreciating God. Now, that's not to say it's wrong, and that's not to say you shouldn't do it at all. It's just simply placing things in their proper place in relation to the ideal. Right? The ideal is one without a second, where we have completely effaced our sense of separateness. We live only by the will of the divine. We have no sense of me and mine, right? This is a realized soul that we're talking about here. This is the reason why I bid you to put down any such clear and insinuating thought and cover it up with a thick cloud of forgetting, no matter how holy it might be, and no matter how well it might promise to help you in your endeavor, because it is love alone that can reach God in this life, and not knowing, right? Not knowing. Now, he's making the same distinction here between knowledge in the worldly sense and well, he just uses the word love, which is a very nice way of saying it, but knowing in the true sense, right? Ramakrishna, that's the first lesson he gives to M in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, where he points out that knowledge, worldly knowledge, is not helpful. Right, and worldly knowledge is anything that we take in through the senses, store in the mind, and then set up its relationships between everything else that's stored in the mind. That's normal education. That's worldly education. But knowing, true knowledge, the only knowledge we're concerned with is the knowledge of who we are. Right? That's the knowledge that ultimately we and the beloved are one. And that knowledge will take us all the way, as infinitely. Wherever it is that we're going, that's going to take us there. This knowledge of love, this knowledge of our nature as love and wisdom and being. Right? So, in the same way, it would be very inappropriate and a great hindrance to a man who ought to be working in this darkness and in this cloud of unknowing with an effective impulse of love to God for himself alone, to permit any thought or any meditation on God's wonderful gifts, on his kindness or his work in any of his creatures, bodily or spiritual, to rise up in his mind so as to press between him and his God. And that's why he's saying this is lesser, because it creates a separation between you and God, between him and his God, even if they should be very holy thoughts and give him great happiness and consolation, right? This is the reason why I bid you to put down any such clear and insinuating thought and to cover it up with a thick cloud of forgiving, so that no matter how holy it might be and no matter how well it might promise to help you in your endeavor, because it is love alone that can reach God in this life and not knowing. For as long as the soul dwells in this mortal body, the clarity of our understanding in the contemplation of all spiritual things, and especially of God, is always mixed up with some sort of imagination, some sort of impurity. That's what Ramakrishna says. That God is the only thing that has not been polluted by the tongue, not given an attribute. Right? Everything else can be spoken. Anything spoken must be created. Right? Anything spoken is limited and manifested. And because of it, this exercise of ours would be tainted, and it would be very surprising if it did not lead us into great error. Right? That's his summary. All right, that's the end of that chapter. Anybody get what he's saying? Anybody understand where we're going, where he's going with all this? It's very familiar territory within Bhakti Yoga, within Raja Yoga, and within Jnana Yoga, right? This notion of oneness with God, having nothing separating us, and that through love, right, through the love of the presence, we find our union with God. All right. Chapter 9. Chapter 9. During this exercise, the calling to mind of the holiest creature God ever made is a hindrance rather than a help. The intense activity, therefore, of your understanding, which will always press upon you when you set yourself to this dark contemplation, must always be put down. For if you do not put it down, it will put you down. So much so that when you imagine that you can best abide in this darkness and that nothing is in your mind except God alone, if you take a close look, you will find that your mind is occupied, not with this darkness, but with a clear picture of something beneath God. If this is in fact so, then indeed that thing is above you for the moment and between you and your God. So set yourself to put down such clear pictures, no matter how holy or how pleasant they may be. All right, so he's talking very distinctly here about a Jnana Yoga practice, right? Which is surprising because he's talking about a Jnana Yoga practice from within a bhakti tradition, a devotional tradition, right? Which is a very, a very interesting concept, right? We can't help but see that coming in through the Vedanta, where we've got the four paths clearly laid out, and you'll find that, and this is what Ramakrishna taught. You know, he said the paths are not distinguished; they're not separate, right? It's not that you can only be a Jnani yogi or you can only be a bhakti yogi. If you're a bhakti yogi, you can't have any jnana. It's not like that. It's a matter of emphasis, right? If you look closely in Christianity, which is a bhakti tradition, if you look closely in there, you'll see elements of karma yoga. You know, where in the judgment scene, when the wicked people say, Jesus, when were you hungry? You know, or when the righteous people say, Jesus, when were you hungry and we gave you water? When were you, or thirsty and we gave you water? When were you hungry and we gave you food? And Jesus says, in that to the least of these that you gave water, you gave me water. To the extent that in these who were hungry, that you fed them, you gave me food. Right? So that's karma yoga. That's doing service as worship of God in each other. Right? So in our bhakti traditions, in our love of God, we can still have room for a jnanic practice where we sit in the presence, but we don't give it form, we don't give it attribute. You know, we just accept grace, really. That's really what we're doing. We're opening to the idea of grace, and grace is an ego eraser. You know, to contemplate grace is an ego eraser. Because to accept infinite grace, you must have infinite humility, right? To let somebody do everything for you, you have to be willing to do nothing for yourself. And that is where the contemplation of grace leads us. And that's not to say that we then do nothing. It's then that we begin to act on pure inspiration from the image of God within, which is what Paul is describing when he says, it is no longer I who live, but the Christ who lives in me. Right? That's what happens. When you efface your ego completely through the contemplation of the beloved, of the grace of God, of the nature of God, ego is erased. And through that erasure, what then begins to happen is that people look at you and see the actions and words of God. They no longer see a self-interested individual plotting his own themes and games. They see the action of the universe through itself, right? They're looking through a hole at God. And this is the glory and the wonder of realization, right? And this is the highest gift of grace, right? To be indistinguishable from our nature, to be indistinguishable from God, that there is no separation there. One thing I must tell you, this blind impulse of love toward God for himself alone, this secret love beating on this cloud of unknowing, is more profitable for the salvation of your soul, more worthy in itself, and more pleasing to God and to all the saints and angels in heaven, yes, and of more use to all your friends, both bodily and spiritually, whether they are alive or dead. And it is better for you to experience this spiritually in your affection than it is to have the eye of your soul opened in contemplation, either in seeing all the angels and the saints in heaven, or in hearing all the mirth or the melody that is amongst those who are in bliss. Right? So he's singing the praise of love for love's sake. Right? The highest form of love requires nothing in return. The highest form of love is for its own sake, simply because it's love, right? And so this is why when we see Vivekananda, when he was visiting the master, and the master wanted to find out why he came to see him. And so for a month, the master wouldn't even look at Vivekananda, didn't talk to him for a month, didn't even look at him. And at the end of that month, Vivekananda was still coming and was completely unbothered. And Ramakrishna finally says, "Why are you here? Why do you come here? I haven't talked to you in a month. I haven't even looked at you in a month, and you're still here." And Vivekananda said, I come here because I love you. I'm not here for you to talk to me or treat me in a certain way or to say something. I'm here because I love you. Love for love's sake is the highest love. And so what our man here is telling us is in our spiritual practice to do it not for our salvation, to do it not for our gift of heaven, if you believe in such things, to do it not for realization, but to do it for its own sake, because to be with the beloved is the highest pleasure, the highest ideal, right? And so we just surrender ourselves to it, open to it completely, and then we become that, right? Nor need you be surprised at what I say, for if you could once see it as clearly as you can come by grace to touch it, and to experience it in this life, you would think as I do. But take it for granted that no man shall ever have such clear sight here in this life, but the feeling that a man can have through grace, when God deigns to grant it. So lift up your love to that cloud, or rather, if I am to speak more truthfully, let God draw your love up to that cloud, and try, through the help of his grace, to forget every other thing. Right? So here he says it, puts it in words. What is it that brings us there? It is the grace of God. Right? And in the Vedanta also, Holy Mother says, when she's asked by that young disciple, what is it that brings us to realization? Is it our meditation? Is it our singing? Is it our service? And Mother says, none of them. She says the realization only comes through grace. Right? Why is that? Because you're not the doer. If you ain't the doer, what else do you got? Nothing. So when you sit to practice, nothing that you can do is going to bring you to your realization. And so you sit there in the presence for its own sake, because it's beautiful, because God is beautiful, because love is the highest ideal. And that's why you do it, to enjoy God, to enjoy presence, to enjoy the dissolution of ego. And so you place yourself there. And if anything ever comes of it, beautiful. If nothing else comes of it, you sat in the presence of light, right? Still beautiful. So you do it for its own sake. And you try to forget everything else. Let go of all of your wrong ideas, all of your selfish ideas, all of your small ideas, all of the noise. Let go of all of it and be. A simple awareness of anything under God, which forces itself upon your will and consciousness, puts you further away from God than you would be if it did not exist. It hinders you and makes you less able to feel by experience the fruit of his love. How much more then do you think that an awareness which is drawn to yourself knowingly and deliberately will hinder you in your purpose? And if the consciousness of any particular saint or pure spiritual thing hinders you so much, how do you think that that consciousness of any living person in this wretched life, or any corporeal or worldly thing, will hinder you and be an obstacle to you in this exercise? Right? So he's saying if even the thought of these saints places something between you and God, he says, wow, think of how much more something of this world that's in your mind separates you from God, right? So he's really setting a high bar here, real talking in the languages of Vivekananda, This is a very high ideal. I am not saying that any such simple, sudden thought of any good and spiritual thing under God which presses against your will or your understanding, or is willfully drawn into your mind deliberately or in order to increase your devotion, is therefore evil, even though it is a hindrance to this sort of exercise, and God forbid that you should understand it so. But I do say that in spite of its goodness and holiness, in this exercise, it is more of a hindrance than a help. I mean, during the time of the exercise. For certainly he who seeks to have God perfectly will not take his rest in the consciousness of any angel or in any saint that is in heaven. Right? So he's saying, yeah, it is a lower thing to have anything between you and God, but it's not a sin, he's saying. Uh it's not necessarily a detrimental thing. It's not the perfect thing, is all he's saying. And so for us, I think I would put in the message that know this. This is that knowledge of oneness that Ramakrishna talks about. He says, take this knowledge of oneness, this very high ideal, this pure and perfect thought, and tie it in the corner of your dhoti. Put it in your pocket, just that you're aware of it. You always know it's there. You know it's always true. And he says that will inform your love of God and prevent you from using it egotistically. If you know that the ultimate truth is one without a second, then you can always use that to temper yourself, to never get high on egotism, I guess. To don't get high on what your mind tells you you're accomplishing. Right? To keep it pure as you possibly can. But don't worry about it to an extent where your worrying about it becomes the obstacle. Simply keep the knowledge in your pocket and go forward. Right. All right, we'll stop there for the day.